Linda had always thought that the worst phone call of her life had already come and gone. The one when she was laid off after 25 years of teaching. Or maybe the one when her mother had passed away. But this call shattered everything. Mrs. Walker? The voice on the other end was professional. Calm. Almost clinical. Your husband was brought into our about an hour ago. He's stable. But there's something you need to be aware of. Linda's heart clenched. The groceries she had been holding slipped from her grasp. A carton of eggs shattering against the floor. What happened? Is he hurt? No severe injuries. But he seems to be experiencing memory loss. He doesn't remember much of his recent life. A short pause. He doesn't seem to recognize you. Linda felt the air leave her lungs. Mark. Her Mark. The man she had loved for over 30 years. The man who knew her favorite songs. The way she liked her tea. The exact way she hummed when she was deep in thought. And now, he didn't know her at all. She barely remembered how she got to the hospital. The next thing she knew, she was standing in the doorway of his room, gripping the strap of her purse like it was the only thing holding her together. He was sitting on the bed, his brow furrowed in confusion, staring out the window as if trying to place where he was. Linda stepped closer, her voice trembling. Mark? Slowly, he turned his head, his blue eyes, the ones she had stared into on their wedding day. The ones that had crinkled with laughter during late-night conversations, looked at her now with polite detachment. I'm sorry, he said. Do I know you? Linda's stomach twisted into a knot so tight she thought she might never breathe again. She had imagined growing old with him, sharing inside jokes that no one else understood, holding hands even when their hair turned gray. But now, as she stood before him, he was nothing more than a stranger. Linda felt the weight of his words press against her chest. Crushing, suffocating. Do I know you? She had never imagined hearing that from Mark. Not in 1,000 lifetimes. She swallowed the lump in her throat and forced a smile, though her hands trembled at her sides. Yes, Mark. You do. I'm your wife. Mark blinked, as if trying to process the words. But there was no recognition in his eyes. No flicker of warmth. No sign that he remembered the countless nights they had spent talking until dawn. The morning coffee he always made for her before she woke up. The way he used to whisper I love you when he thought she was asleep. I'm sorry, he said again, his voice apologetic, almost distant. I don't remember. Linda clutched the back of the chair beside his bed, needing something solid to ground her. The doctor's voice echoed in her mind. Temporary amnesia. Possible memory gaps. But the words felt empty. Clinical. Nothing could have prepared her for the sheer agony of looking into the eyes of the man she loved and seeing a stranger. She took a shaky breath and stepped closer. That's okay, she said softly, though every fiber of her being screamed that it wasn't. You hit your head. The doctors say your memory might come back soon. He studied her carefully, as if assessing whether he should believe her. Then his gaze dropped to her left hand. The wedding ring. He glanced down at his own hand, where an identical ring sat on his finger. A shadow of doubt flickered across his face. So, we're married? For 30 years, she whispered. She expected the realization to spark something. But he only nodded, like someone processing a fact about a distant relative. Did we have kids? Linda's breath hitched. No, just us. Mark exhaled, leaning back against the pillows. His expression was unreadable, but to Linda, it was worse than anger. Worse than fear. It was indifference. The man who had once known her better than anyone in the world now looked at her as if she were a kind stranger offering him directions. She couldn't breathe. She needed air. I'm going to get some water, she said quickly, turning before he could see the tears brimming in her eyes. Out in the hallway, she pressed her palms against her face, trying to steady herself. This wasn't happening. It couldn't be happening. The door opened behind her, and a nurse stepped out. Mrs. Walker? Linda wiped her tears away and straightened. Yes? The nurse hesitated. I just wanted to check on you. I know this must be incredibly difficult. Linda let out a broken laugh. Difficult? My husband has forgotten our entire life together. I don't even know if he still loves me. The nurse's face softened. Memory loss is tricky, but love isn't just about memories. It's deeper than that. Give him time. Linda nodded, but deep inside, She couldn't shake the fear coiling around her heart. What if time wasn't enough? What if Mark never came back to her? Linda spent the night in the hospital chair beside Mark's bed, watching him sleep. His breathing was steady, his face peaceful. It was cruel, she thought. How normal he looked. Like the man she had kissed goodnight every evening for the past 3 decades. But when morning came, she knew nothing had changed. When his eyes fluttered open, they met hers without recognition. He didn't flinch, didn't recoil. He simply looked at her with that same polite detachment. The same way he might look at a friendly neighbor passing by. Linda forced a smile, trying to keep her voice light. "Good morning." Mark nodded. "Morning." He glanced around the sterile white room, then back at her. I assume we live together?" Her chest tightened, but she nodded. "Yes. We have a home. A beautiful one. I can take you there today. If you feel up to it." He hesitated. "The doctor said I should be somewhere familiar. Maybe it will help." She latched onto the hope in his voice. No matter how faint. "Yes," she agreed quickly. "It might." By noon, she was driving him home, her hands gripping the wheel tighter than usual. She wanted to talk to him, to fill the silence, but she was terrified of saying the wrong thing. Would he feel overwhelmed if she mentioned something too personal? Would he pull away if she reminded him of something he still couldn't recall? So she said nothing. When they arrived, Mark stepped out of the car slowly, his gaze scanning the front yard. The familiar blue shutters, the white swing on the porch. He frowned. "It feels familiar, but not in a way I can place." Linda's heart leapt with cautious hope. Maybe it was a sign that his memory was stirring, even if just a little. She led him inside, watching as his eyes moved over the framed pictures on the walls. Their wedding photo, a vacation in Italy, a Christmas morning years ago. She saw him linger on a particular photo, one taken on their 25th anniversary. In it, he had his arms wrapped around her, both of them laughing like two people who had never doubted their love. He reached out and picked it up, studying it carefully. Linda held her breath. "Does that look familiar?" He tilted his head, as if searching for something in the depths of his mind. For a moment, she thought she saw a flicker of recognition, the ghost of something almost remembered. But then he sighed and shook his head. "No, I'm sorry." Her heart sank. "That's okay," she said softly, forcing a smile. "You're home now. We'll take it one step at a time." Mark nodded, setting the picture back down. "I appreciate that, Linda." Linda, not darling, not love, not the affectionate nicknames he had always called her. Just Linda. It felt like losing him all over again. Linda moved through the house as if she were guiding a guest rather than welcoming home her husband. She pointed out small details, the kitchen table where they'd had countless morning coffees, the bookshelf where he always kept his favorite detective novels, the leather chair by the fireplace where he would read late into the night. Mark nodded politely at each thing, but it was clear he wasn't feeling the connection she desperately hoped for. She took a deep breath. "Would you like some tea? You always say it helps you think." Mark hesitated, then nodded. "That sounds nice." Linda went to the kitchen, her hands trembling as she set the kettle on the stove. This was Mark's favorite tea, the same one she had made for him every night for years. Would his body remember what his mind could not? She brought the steaming mug over to him, watching as he took a sip. He closed his eyes briefly, savoring the taste. "This is good," he said, as if surprised. "You've always loved it." He looked at her, brows knitting together in thought. "I have?" She nodded, willing herself not to look too eager. "Yes. Every night before bed. It was part of our routine." Mark set the mug down carefully. "I don't remember, but I like it." It was something. Not much, but something. That night, Linda set up the guest room for him. "You don't have to," Mark said when he saw the fresh sheets. "If this is my home, I can sleep in our." He stopped himself, clearing his throat. "Your bed." Linda's heart clenched. "It's okay," she said gently. "I want you to be comfortable." She lay awake for hours, staring at the ceiling, listening to the quiet. In all their years together, she had never slept without Mark beside her. Even on nights when they argued, when one of them was upset, they always ended up in the same bed. Because no matter what, They belonged to each other. Now, just down the hall, he was a world away. The next morning, she found him in the living room, flipping through an old photo album. He looked up as she approached, tapping a finger against one of the pictures. When was this? Linda peered over his shoulder. The photo was from a road trip they had taken years ago. Standing in front of a beaten-up old motel sign, grinning like two kids. That was on our anniversary trip to the mountains, she said, a soft smile on her lips. It was pouring rain, and the car broke down. We had to stay in that awful little motel for the night. Mark studied the image. I don't remember it. Linda swallowed back the disappointment and sat beside him. Do you want me to tell you about it? Mark hesitated, then nodded. And so she did. She told him about the rain-soaked clothes. How they had laughed until their sides hurt while trying to fix the windshield wipers. How they had danced in their tiny motel room with only a radio playing static-filled old songs. As she spoke, she saw something shift in his expression, not full recognition, but something close, like a whisper of familiarity brushing against his mind. He traced the edge of the photo. I can almost picture it, he admitted quietly. Linda held her breath. Almost as good, she said softly. Almost means you're on your way back. Mark looked at her then. Really looked at her, and for the first time, she thought she saw a flicker of the man she had loved for so long. It wasn't much, but it was a start. The days passed in a delicate dance of patience and hope. Linda knew she couldn't rush Mark's memory, but every time he hesitated before calling her name, every time he looked at an old photo with confusion rather than recognition, a small piece of her heart cracked. But she held on. Each morning, she made his favorite breakfast, scrambled eggs with just the right amount of pepper, toast with a thin layer of strawberry jam. She watched carefully as he took the first bite, hoping some part of him would remember that this was how they had started their mornings together for years. It's good, Mark said, chewing thoughtfully. Do I usually eat this? She forced a smile. Yes. You always say I make it better than any restaurant. He gave her a small, polite nod but didn't say more. That night, she found him in the den, sitting in his old leather chair, staring at the shelves filled with books he had collected over the years. She took a cautious step forward. You love reading. Mystery novels. Mostly. You always try to solve the case before the detective does. Mark picked up a book, flipping through the pages without focus. I must have spent a lot of time in this chair. Linda's voice softened. You did. Sometimes you'd get so lost in a book that you wouldn't even hear me calling you for dinner. A small smile ghosted his lips. That sounds like something I'd do. Something in her chest tightened. The way he had said it, it wasn't a memory, but it was an acknowledgement. A small, fragile connection between the man he was now and the man she had spent decades loving. She walked over, sitting on the edge of the couch. Would you like me to read to you? Mark hesitated but then nodded. She picked up one of his old favorites. Flipping to the beginning, her voice was steady, familiar, as she read the opening lines. The same way she had done countless times before when he had a headache. When he was too exhausted to hold the book himself. When they simply enjoyed the comfort of being close. She read until the words blurred together. Until she could barely keep her eyes open. And then, just as she was about to close the book, she felt something, a warm weight against her hand. Mark's hand, resting lightly atop hers. He wasn't looking at her, his gaze still on the book. But he hadn't moved away. Linda held still, not daring to breathe, afraid that if she moved, the moment would shatter. It wasn't a declaration of love. It wasn't a memory returning. But it was something. And for now, that was enough. The touch of his hand lingered long after he had pulled away. It was the first time, since that awful day in the hospital, that Mark had reached for her in any way. Linda wanted to believe it was instinct, that some part of him, buried beneath the memory loss, still knew her, still felt her. She held on to that hope. The next morning, Linda woke up earlier than usual, a habit she had picked up since Mark came home. She tiptoed past the guest room, expecting him to still be asleep. But when she reached the kitchen, she found him standing by the window, a cup of coffee in his hands. She stilled. Mark never made his own coffee. Not because he couldn't, but because he always preferred the way she made it. A cautious hope flickered inside her. "Good morning," she said, keeping her voice light. He turned at the sound of her voice, his eyes studying her in a way that made her stomach twist. Not in fear, not in recognition, but in something close to curiosity. "I woke up early," he said, taking a sip. "Figured I'd give it a try." She smiled, stepping closer. "And?" He scrunched his nose slightly, looking down at the mug. "It's not great." A startled laugh escaped her. And for a moment, it felt normal, like before. Mark chuckled softly, shaking his head. "I guess I used to drink it the way you made it." "Huh? You did," she said, gently taking the mug from his hands. "You liked it with just a little cream and one sugar. Too much sugar, and you'd complain it tasted like syrup." Mark leaned against the counter, arms crossed. "And how did I like my eggs?" Linda blinked. This was new. He was asking questions now. She tried to steady her voice. "Scrambled. Just a little pepper. No salt." He nodded, processing the information. "What about weekends? Did we do anything special?" Her breath hitched. "You always made pancakes on Saturdays." "It was our tradition." Mark exhaled, rubbing the back of his neck. "That sounds nice." He wasn't saying he remembered, but he wasn't rejecting it either. Encouraged, Linda turned to the stove, pouring his coffee down the sink and making a fresh cup the way she always had. She handed it to him, watching closely as he took a sip. For a long moment, he just stood there, the warmth of the cup pressed against his lips. Then, something changed. His eyes softened, just slightly. "This," he murmured, almost to himself. "This feels right." Linda swallowed against the lump in her throat. It wasn't a memory, but it was a feeling. And sometimes, she thought, feelings were stronger than memories. For the next few weeks, life became a delicate routine. Linda didn't push him to remember, but she surrounded him with things that felt like home, soft reminders of the life they had built together. She played their favorite music in the background. She left out the old quilt his grandmother had made, the one he used to wrap around himself during cold mornings. She made the meals he loved, hoping that taste and scent might bring back what words could not. And slowly, something shifted. Mark stopped flinching when she reached for him. He started leaning into her presence instead of away from it. He didn't call her darling yet, but he didn't say her name like a stranger either. Then one night, it happened. It was late, and Linda was curled up on the couch, reading. Mark had been quiet all evening, his gaze drifting toward the photo album on the coffee table, flipping through the pages but never saying much. But now, his voice broke the silence. "Linda." She looked up, surprised by the way he said it. Soft, thoughtful, almost reverent. He held up an old photograph. "Their wedding picture. I remember this," he said quietly. Linda's breath caught in her throat. "You do?" He nodded slowly, his fingers tracing the edge of the photo. "Not everything. It's like a light flickering on in a dark room. But I remember the way you looked at me that day." Linda moved closer, her hands trembling. "And how did I look at you?" Mark turned to her, his blue eyes locking onto hers. "Like I was your whole world." Tears burned in her eyes. "You were." Mark reached out, hesitating just for a moment before tucking a strand of hair behind her ear. The touch was gentle, familiar. "Linda," he murmured, voice thick with emotion. "I don't have all my memories yet. Maybe I never will. But when I look at you, I feel it." She inhaled sharply, her heart swelling with something she hadn't dared to hope for. "Feel what?" she whispered. His fingers curled around hers, his grip steady, certain. "That I love you." Linda let out a shaky laugh, her tears finally spilling over. "You've always loved me." Mark smiled, and this time, it wasn't the polite smile of a stranger. It was his smile, the one that had always belonged to her. And in that moment, Linda knew, memories might fade, but love? Love was the one thing that could never be lost. The days that followed were not perfect. Mark's memory didn't return all at once, and some parts of their past remained hazy, like pages torn out of a book. There were mornings when he would pause before saying her name, moments when he still looked at an old photograph with distant eyes. But there were also new memories being made. Linda found herself falling in love with him all over again, not just the man he had been. but the man he was becoming. And perhaps, in some strange way, this was a gift. For the first time in decades, they were choosing each other again, not because of routine, not because of habit, but because, despite everything, love had never truly left. One crisp autumn morning, Linda woke up to the scent of coffee brewing. She blinked in surprise, pushing back the covers and padding into the kitchen. Mark was standing at the stove, carefully flipping pancakes. She leaned against the doorway, watching him in quiet awe. "You're making breakfast?" she asked, voice laced with amusement. He turned, grinning slightly. "I figured it was time I started remembering our traditions." Linda's throat tightened. "Do you remember?" Mark hesitated, then shook his head. "Not exactly, but I remember how it felt. And I know I want to make you smile." Her heart swelled. Maybe that was enough. They sat together at the table, sharing pancakes, sipping coffee, and for the first time in what felt like forever, the silence between them was comfortable, not filled with uncertainty, not weighed down by loss. Later that afternoon, as they walked through the park near their home, a gentle breeze rustled the golden leaves around them. Mark suddenly stopped, his brows furrowing. "What is it?" Linda asked, concern flickering in her chest. Mark glanced at her, then at a wooden bench nearby. "We used to sit here, didn't we?" he murmured. Linda's breath caught. It was their bench, the place where they had sat countless times, feeding the birds, talking about everything and nothing at all. The place where, years ago, he had held her hand and whispered, "I'll love you forever." She nodded, unable to speak. Mark sat down, patting the space beside him. When she settled next to him, he laced his fingers through hers, squeezing gently. "I don't remember every moment, Linda," he admitted, voice low and warm. "But I know this." She turned to him, eyes glistening. "Know what?" He smiled, pressing a kiss to her knuckles. "That I'd choose you, every time." Linda felt tears slip down her cheeks. But this time, they weren't from sadness. They were from hope. The past might be blurred, but their future was clear. And as long as they had each other, they would keep writing new chapters, together. This story isn't just about memory loss. It's about the power of love that transcends time and hardship. It reminds us that true love isn't just about remembering the past. It's about choosing each other every single day, even when things get difficult. Linda and Mark's journey shows us that while memories may fade, the emotions, the connections, and the deep-rooted love we share with someone can never truly be erased. Now, I want to hear from you. Did this story touch your heart? If you loved it, comment number 2 below. If it wasn't for you, comment number 7, and let me know why. Don't forget to hit the like button if you believe in the power of love. And subscribe to the channel for more incredible stories like this. Your support helps keep these stories alive.